Welcome, guys, to class. And today we are going to be discussing drug receptors. We are discussing today drug receptors. This drug receptors. Drug receptors are also called drug targets. So, drug receptors can also be called drug targets. They mean the same thing basically. So, what is a drug receptor? A drug receptor is a macromolecule found on the surface or inside of a cell which helps in signal transduction of the cell. So a drug receptor is a macromolecule found on the surface of a cell which helps in signal transduction of the cell. And these are some of the characteristics of a drug receptor, also called drug target. So a drug receptor is usually, number one, it's a macromolecule. It's a macromolecule that can be found on the inside of the cell or on the outside of the cell. Also, a drug receptor helps the drug to interact with the cell. So, for the drug to interact with the cell, the drug binds to a receptor. So, drug receptors help with drug interaction with the cell. Then, drug receptor, they can be intracellular. That is, they can be found inside of the cell. So drug receptors can be found inside of the cells, they can be intracellular. Drug receptors too can be found outside of the cell. In this case, they are extracellular. Drug receptors are usually proteins. They are usually proteins, not carbohydrates, not fatty acids. A lot of drug receptors are usually proteins. And drug receptors are actually also involved in cellular signaling. They are involved in cellular signaling. They are involved in cell-to-cell communication. So if cells are to communicate, if there is going to be interaction between cells, drug receptors are also very critical for this to happen. So next is classification of receptors. We're classifying drug receptors. Drug receptors are classified broadly into two types. We have the extracellular receptors, the ones that are found outside of the cell, and we also have the intracellular receptors. So drug receptors are classified into two basically. We have the extracellular receptors, also called the surface receptors, and we have the intracellular receptors. So these are the extracellular receptors. They are divided into three major groups. So the extracellular receptors are divided into three major groups. Don't forget that the extracellular receptors are also called the surface receptors, and they're subdivided into ionotropic receptors, metabotropic or G-protein-coupled receptors, and enzyme-linked receptors. The extracellular receptors are classified into three groups. You have the ionotropic receptors, the metabotropic receptors, also called the G-protein-coupled receptors, and you have the enzyme-linked receptors. Then the intracellular receptors include the nuclear receptors. So we begin with the first one, ionotropic receptors. Ionotropic receptors are receptors on which fast-moving neurotransmitters actually act. So ionotropic receptors actually helps in fast synaptic transmission. So if there are going to be transmission between two nerves, if there's going to be a new transmission happening between two nerves, you have ionotropic receptors actually doing that. Okay, so neurotransmitters like acetylcholine and norepinephrine actually work mainly via ionotropic receptors, and they usually act within milliseconds. They act within milliseconds. They act within a very short period of time, and these guys are located in the cell membrane. They are located on the surface membrane actually. Okay, and they usually act on ion channels. So the effector organs of ionotropic receptors are usually ion channels. They're usually ion channels. Then the coupling, what do they act on directly? Their coupling is direct. They bind to the ion channels directly. Okay, they bind to the ion channels directly. So because ionotropic receptors actually bind to the ion channels directly, they are also called ligand-gated channels or ligand-gated receptors. Okay, so when it binds to the channel, it brings a conformational change. It leads to a conformational change on the receptor. And examples of inotropic receptors are your nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, uh, gamma aminobutyric acid uh, sub-A receptor, uh, glutamate receptor, glycine receptor, and 5-HT receptor, also called serotonin receptor. So this is a diagram of an ionotropic receptor. This diagram you're seeing here is a diagram of an ionotropic receptor. Don't forget that ionotropic receptors are also called ligand-gated receptors. Okay, and a typical example is the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. So if you look at the receptor very well, these are the subunits of the receptor. That is subunits, the alpha, gamma, beta, delta subunits. These are the subunits of the receptor. They are usually 5. So this is the cell membrane of the receptor. This is the cell membrane receptor. This is the binding. This is the ligand binding site here. This is the ligand binding site, and this is the ion channel. Ion channel. So the drug binds to the ligand binds to the receptor site on the extracellular domain. So when it binds here, it causes a conformational change on this molecule here on the binding site, leading to the opening of these ion channels. So this is a good example of an ionotropic receptor. What we used to represent this was the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. Okay, the second group of receptors we have are called the G protein coupled receptors. Okay, the G protein coupled receptors. The reason why they are called G protein coupled receptor is because these receptors are usually bound to G proteins. Okay, these receptors are bound to G protein. So receptors that are bound to G proteins are called G protein coupled receptors. Okay, and G proteins are usually GTP binding proteins. They are usually guanosine triphosphate binding proteins, and they have alpha, beta, and gamma subunits. Okay, so the G proteins usually they cross the plasma membrane several times. Okay, so because they cross the plasma membrane 7 times, they are usually also called transmembrane proteins because they actually transverse this plasma membrane 7 times. And the G proteins are usually the largest family of receptors. They include the largest family of receptors. Okay, and these receptors bind to G proteins and they actually transduce the signal to the effector protein. So when they bind to G proteins, the G proteins actually carry the message to the effector proteins. Okay, the G proteins coupled receptors are also called metabotropic receptors. They're also called metabotropic receptors. Okay, metabotropic receptors is another name for G protein coupled receptors, and they're also called transmembrane heptahelical alpha helices receptors because they actually transverse the cell membrane several times, so they are called transmembrane heptahelical receptors. Okay, and they usually act within a short frame of seconds. They act in seconds. So the effector organs, the G protein coupled receptors, the effector cells are usually channels. They could be channels and they could be enzymes too. So they could be channels and they could be enzymes. So in there are channels. The channels that they act on majorly are the potassium channels and the calcium channels. While the enzymes they act on are usually adenyl cyclase, that's adenyl cyclase, and phospholipase C. Okay, phospholipase C, also called PLC. And examples of receptors that are G protein coupled, or examples of receptors that actually function via G proteins, are your adrenoreceptors, your muscarinic receptors, histamine receptors, serotonin receptors, opioid, amine, peptide, and cannabinoid receptors. This is a very good example of a G protein coupled receptor. Okay, so this is the receptor here, and this is the G protein. Okay, so because the receptor is coupled with a G protein. This is a receptor because it is coupled with a G protein. That's why it is called a G protein coupled receptor. So this is actually the target. Okay. So the target, you can also call it the receptor. The receptor right now is inactive. So when the drug binds to, when the agonist or when the ligand binds to the receptor, this G protein is activated. So this is an example of a receptor that is bound to a G protein. So receptors that are bound to G proteins are called G proteins coupled receptors. Okay, the next group of receptors are the kinase-linked receptors. Okay, the kinase-linked receptors, and these receptors majorly are usually found on the cell membrane. So kinase-linked receptors are usually found on the cell membrane, and they are usually receptors that respond to proteins. They respond to proteins majorly. Okay, so because they respond to proteins, they are called protein mediators. They are called protein mediators because these receptors actually respond to proteins majorly. And protein linked receptors or kinase linked receptors, they act for a very long time. Okay, they act for a very long time, and because they act for a very long time, they are evolved usually in growth. They are involved in growth. They are involved in cells proliferation. Okay, yep, they're involved in growth and cells proliferation. So they actually enable growth factors work very well. They enable growth factors to work very well, and because they act for a long time, they actually slow in their action. They slow and require the expression of new genes. So examples examples of molecules that are kinase linked to your growth factors, your cytokines and insulin. So this is actually a diagram. This is a diagram for a kinase linked protein. So you have this is the extracellular domain, this is the transmembrane domain, and this is the intracellular domain. So this is actually where the kinases, the endogenous kinase, is actually where they bind to. Okay, it's actually where the intracellular it is the intracellular part that the endogenous kinases actually binds to. So when they bind, they are phosphorylated. After phosphorylation, that leads to gene expression. So the types of kinase-linked receptors are your tyrosine receptor kinases. For example, insulin receptor. You have the serine or the threonine kinase-linked receptor, TGF, and we have the cytokine kinase-linked receptors. So that's just like the cytokines. So, and the last group of receptors are called the nuclear receptors. They are called the nuclear receptors, and these receptors are actually found on the nucleus. Okay, the nuclear receptors are actually found on the nucleus. Okay, and they are also called ligand-activated transcription factors because when a ligand binds to a nuclear receptor, it leads to transcription of genes. So they're usually present in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. So they transduce signals that actually bring about gene expression or gene transcription. So when a ligand binds to a nuclear receptor, there's usually a modification of gene transcription. Okay, and examples of biomolecules that actually work via nuclear receptors are steroid hormones, thyroid hormones, vitamin A and D, and glucocorticoids. These are examples of biomolecules that actually work via nuclear receptors. They work via nuclear receptors. So normally the ligand binds to the nuclear receptor, and you have the ligand receptor complex form. So this ligand receptor complex is actually what will now initiate gene transcription. Okay, so you have a ligand binding to a nuclear receptor, leading to a ligand receptor complex that now results in a gene expression or gene transcription or whatever. So this is actually the basics of receptors in pharmacology. Thank you. See you next time.